name is Lindsay Syhakhom. I'm an Azure Solutions Architect, and today I'm going to be talking to you about data center migrations with Azure Migrate. For those of you who are not familiar with Azure Migrate, it sounds sort of like a vanilla tool, but let me tell you, you're in for a treat. It is an excellent tool that Microsoft has built and developed over the last several years, really always releasing new feature upgrades to this tool that I think make it one of the most powerful migration tools on the market today. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to briefly touch on migration methodologies, very briefly, since I think we all at this point know the difference between a lift and shift and a modernization initiative. Then I'm going to dive into what is Azure Migrate and how to get started on it. First, just a little bit about Logicworks and why we're kind of qualified to talk to you about this today. Logicworks is a top global Azure migration and managed services partner. So we're not just us saying that. We've sort of validated in the market, both by Microsoft, by Gartner, as having these capabilities. We're a gold Microsoft partner and an Azure Expert MSP. And for those of you who don't know, the Azure Expert MSP is actually an audit that we go through that really validates that we do the work we say we can do and talks to our customers and really gets in the weeds about our practice. Our clients included companies like MassMutual, Barclays, Chewy. We work a lot with highly regulated companies because we are ourselves high trust certified, PCI DSS level certified, and all these other certifications we go through on our own practice. These are our services. We offer everything from migration all the way through managed services and managed security. And today, obviously, the focus of the conversation is going to be on migration. We perform hundreds of cloud migrations every year, so I'm kind of in the front row seat of that. I actually work on client projects, so that's why I was asked to talk to you today to give you some kind of real-life intel of how these migrations go and why Logicworks uses Azure Migrate to perform a lot of our Azure migrations. So let's talk about planning for migration. So this slide, if you've attended basically any Microsoft webinar, in the last 10 years, you've probably seen some version of this slide, which is their cloud adoption framework for Azure. It begins, with a strategy phase, moving on to planning, which is really about understanding what you have on-prem in order to prepare for moving it. Then the ready phase, which is pretty critical. You have to actually deploy in Azure your kind of your landing zone. Some people call it a target architecture. That's basically your network foundation for what's going to go to Azure. Then the actual adoption phase, the actual migration of VMs or migration to a PaaS service. And finally, the govern and management phase. So this is the overarching cloud adoption framework. What I want to talk about today is Azure Migrate actually helps us in several of these phases. So some people think of Azure Migrate as just the assessment tool, which it was several years ago. But since then, it's with all the new feature upgrades that Microsoft has released, it is now also a migration tool. So both in the plan phase, as seen in this diagram, and the adopt phase, we're going to talk about how Migrate helps us in both of those phases. In reality, I know that diagram is sort of the theoretical perfect migration. When I talk to customers, they basically come to me and say, we know we want to move to Azure. We already have a business case for doing so, or there's pressure from our customers or pressure from our executive team. And we have, a vCenter expert or whatever. We have a list of servers. Now what, basically? And before they commit to migration, they need to know, how much is this going to cost? What should we migrate and what should we keep in the data center? What's our project plan and timeline going to be? And most importantly, how do we balance what services we use in Azure? Should we use PaaS services? Should we use infrastructure as a service services? So all those questions are, despite the sort of perfect migration plan, where people normally begin is this sense of what do I have and how do I get it to Azure and what's it going to cost? Azure Migrate has now become our kind of key tool that we actually install fairly early in this process, basically right at the beginning of a project, because it gives us this sense of the full digital landscape before we conduct a migration. So let's talk about Azure Migrate. It is really a centralized migration hub, as I keep talking about. It's got a discovery and assessment faculty. It's also got a migration capability. Let's go through each of these one by one, because I feel like as an engineer, it's really important to understand what actually is the service, right? Essentially, it is Azure Migrate. They've developed an appliance. You install the appliance in your VMware environment and on physical servers, and Hyper-V, it supports all those. It's agentless, and essentially it requires a guest user account for Windows servers, and it can discover your entire digital estate. It also can do some application discovery that's sort of like accurate to a certain extent, and data is encrypted at rest and in transit. That's the discovery function. It's got a GUI, so basically almost anybody could set this up, right? If you've been in the cloud space for some time, you'll know that there are probably dozens or even hundreds of tools that perform some kind of discovery, right? But where the secret sauce of Azure Migrate really comes in is in this assess phase. So, like I said, the key question that most customers ask is, what is this going to cost me to run on Azure, right? And how do I get a really accurate idea of what that's going to cost me based on certain conditions? That is the assess phase is where you understand that. So what you do is you take whatever machines are discovered in the discovery phase, right? It basically gives you a giant output of VMs. Let's just assume in this scenario that we're using VMware just for ease of conversation. You then select either a small subset of machines or the whole estate, and you run an assessment. In the assessment panel in the GUI, you basically get to choose a bunch of criteria for how you want to map what's on-prem to what's going to be in Azure. And this is the most important thing, this section right here, where I talk about what you get to choose or select in terms of assessment properties. This is where a lot of people get things wrong. And so it's really important to pay attention to those assessment criteria. For instance, if you're going to migrate like for like, you want what you're running on-prem to run in Azure, you have to make that determination in the assessment properties. You can decide, do I want to right size while I migrate, or do I want to right size after I migrate and just do like for like now? Because Azure is going to suggest to you, obviously, that you right size. It's going to suggest the most optimized thing. But I'll tell you, in the conversations that I have, a good percentage of customers don't want to take the risk of right-sizing in the initial phase of migration. They decide, you know what, we're going to run like for now, and then we're going to right-size later. Another important factor is things like comfort level. Basically, comfort level means you multiply this number based on the performance or right-sizing that you want to do. So basically, if you do 1 for 1, you're taking the maximum level of right sizing based on their suggestions. So we recommend something like 1.2 to give you a little cushion so that you're not being the most aggressive in terms of right sizing assessment. This is the actual, on the left-hand side of the screen, this is the output that this assessment can give you. It's got multiple tabs, let me tell you. And it's basically giving you this VM that you're running on-prem should be translated to this VM size that you can run in Azure. You can also even get dependency mapping. That's an agentless service that Microsoft released. You can actually see the networking connections between those VMs. So really, really powerful tool. We often take this Azure Migrate assessment, this thing on the left, we then go through it manually with our clients and use it to build the business case for migrating to Azure. So like I said, we actually do this fairly early in a migration project so that we really get all the data and intelligence we need to make accurate decisions about what's the right thing to move first. So we've taken care of the first 2 steps in this migration plan. The next step is the landing zone, right? Well, Azure Migrate is many things, and I've talked about how great Azure Migrate is in this presentation. It can't deploy your networking foundation in Azure. You have to do that. And that's what we do at Logicworks as an Azure sort of architecture design and foundation build. And we spend a lot of time in this process saying, what is the optimal network foundation for your resources? And let's build a POC, a proof of concept, sort of networking hub, so that we can migrate a couple of resources and make sure it's functioning well before we do the full migration. We spend a lot of time on this design phase because it's really important for our clients to get the design validated by multiple stakeholders rather than building out the whole thing and getting the built out thing approved by multiple stakeholders. I think you can all understand the reason why that's more efficient use of time. So finally, as I said, Azure Migrate is not just an assessment tool, it's also a migration tool. And what do I mean by that? It uses the same Azure Migrate appliance, so it is agentless. And yes, it builds the Azure VMs for you. It's not just a data replication tool, it actually builds out your target Azure VMs. And that's why it's so important to go through the tool, as you see on the right, to decide, okay, not only what are the names of the VMs going to be, but what are the target settings? How aggressive do we want to be in right sizing? Should we run a certain type of instance family so that we can have reserved instances? Those decisions are really critical in this Azure Migrate phase. Just so you understand sort of from a technical standpoint, how does this actually work? In VMware, it just works by using the technologies you're probably already familiar with. It uses VMware snapshots and change block tracking to replicate data from disks to Azure. So some final sort of important Azure Migrate details, things we've learned over the hundreds of projects that we've done. The first is, don't rely on Azure Migrate cost data alone. It's an incredibly powerful tool to get those calculations out of the assessment, as I said, but you have to go sort of group by group of servers through all those calculations and assumptions to get things right. It could be that you want to be more aggressive in right sizing on a certain group of instances, and other groups of instances like production, you don't want to right size. And so that's why it's important to go server by server. And that brings me to my next point, which is we suggest for the vast majority of customers that they don't buy reserved instances on day one, that they wait 2 to 6 months to assess how they're doing in Azure and then to right size. That means that in your actual Azure assessment, where you're trying to figure out costs, we generally recommend that you use on-demand pricing to get that cost. And why? Because we actually like to see the worst case scenario before we get to the best case scenario, right? So that we're not surprised when we get to Azure that costs are more than we expected. Next, I just wanted to highlight that yes, your Windows licensing can come with you with Azure Migrate. This is also obviously an incredibly powerful feature that, as long as you have software assurance, basically in your licensing agreement, that your Windows licensing, both for SQL and for Windows Server, can come with you. And finally, the one thing I wanted to mention from this slide is that Azure Migrate supports Azure App Services. If you guys aren't familiar with Azure App Services, I highly recommend you check it out. Azure Migrate is not just for migrating to Azure VMs. Azure App Services is a PaaS service for things like .NET, where it's especially powerful. I think there's no service on the market that's quite like Azure App Services, especially for .NET. So if you have a .NET web application and you want to migrate it to Azure, it is a relatively small incremental lift to explore Azure App Services versus running it out of VM, and highly recommend that you do that. It's a feature of Azure Migrate. So if you guys are interested in having an assessment done with Azure Migrate and with experts who understand how to set up Azure Migrate and how to interpret the data from Azure Migrate, Logicworks does sort of a fast 2 to 3 week discovery and assessment of your entire data center to prepare for a POC in Azure. And here's the link you can explore to check that out. And what it actually means is we will really sit down with you, as a solutions architect likely, will sit down with you and say, okay, what does it make sense to move now? What makes sense to have as a POC? If you already have some resources in Azure, which you likely do, We can even discover what's already in Azure to make sure that it's up to well-architected standards, and that anything that in the future you might migrate into that environment is also up to well-architected standards. So that's our Azure assessment product. And thanks for joining.